Welcome to 10-Minute Edwards, where we learn the theology of Jonathan Edwards 1 minute at a time. I am Kyle Strobel, your host, and the clock starts now. Well, hello, and welcome back to 10-Minute Edwards. As always, I am Kyle Strobel, here with dear old Jonathan at warp speed, and of course, Montgomery Bruce. Today, we're doing something a little different because if you remember from the second video when I kind of charted out how I'm going to move through these, we talked about God, and then we're going to move to creation, and then we're going to hold creation in kind of contrast with perfection and eternity, and because it's going to be important to see how those kind of play off of each other and add to kind of a mutual understanding of each. But before we do that, we're in this kind of curious space where we need to talk about God in eternity, so God prior to creation, before turning to creation, and yet we're kind of talking about God preparing to create, as it were. And so let me just start with why this question. This is a topic we would often talk about as the decrees or the councils. Sometimes you hear the language of pactum salutis, the eternal covenant of redemption. And so let me just give you a couple biblical texts. So take Ephesians 1:11 as an example. In him, this is in Christ, of course, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. And so notice that there is a counsel of God's will, and that these things have been predestined according to his purposes. So when we talk about God's purposes and we talk about his willing, right? Well, what are we talking about there? Or take 1 Corinthians 2:7, where Paul says, "But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory." So when we think about, well, what does it mean for God to decree before the ages? So before the ages, we're in eternity and God's decreeing. Or, and this is a passage that is used by von Maastricht. He starts his discussion of the creeds. Remember, von Maastricht's one of Edwards' favorite theologians. He starts with Isaiah 14:26 through 27. "This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back?" So when Edwards, and of course when the kind of just tradition, he's not the first one to do this by any stretch, but when particularly the Reformed tradition are reading these passages, they know we're dealing with eternity, but we're not dealing with ontology. Let me explain that a bit. We're not dealing with God in and of himself, in his fullness. We might say we're not dealing with what constitutes God as God. We're now dealing with God turning externally to himself to create and to consider the nature of creation. But here's where we get this tension. So let me just quote Edwards here now. He says, "Christ has substituted himself in their stead from eternity." Now, here Edwards talking about the elect, and he's saying Christ from eternity, so this is prior to creation, he's saying, is substituting himself in their stead. So he's kind of looking and seeing the very people that don't yet exist, and he's saying he is substituting himself eternally. Now, if you know anything about what's gone on in the last decade or so in evangelicalism, there was a lot of confusion about this very topic because many people began talking about the eternal subordination of the Son. And many of them began using Edwards as an example of this. Now, here's the problem, is that technically, in this era of Reformed thinkers, the Son is eternally subordinated to the Father. He is not ontologically subordinate to the Father. And so again, this is Edwards foreseeing this problem and explaining it. He says, though a subordination of the persons of the Trinity in their actings is not from any proper natural subjection one to another. He's like, look, he's using here nature, like God as he is in and of himself. There's no subordination in God. That doesn't happen, right? The Son is not in any way subordinate to the Father in their own life. And yet, he's going to say in eternity, prior to creation, they begin willing the covenant of redemption. That's going to actually, as we'll see, be the basis of creation. So it's not that God first thinks creation and then thinks redemption. It's that God is already planning and covenanting for redemption even prior to creation. Now, of course, you do think creation first and redemption second. You don't presumably think of redeeming what you have not thought about to create. But prior to the act of creation, God has already covenanted with himself to redeem. So that, I mean, you often get this discussed as, again, the eternal covenant of redemption. But Edwards is going to add something that is often missed. And this is often missed by those who are trying to employ Edwards for their kind of eternal subordination of the Son. Is that Edwards adds, so if we can think of this in layers, the first layer is God in and of himself. Utter fullness, utter completeness, pure actuality. No potentiality. There's utter fullness of God. God has no need. There's no subordination. God, as Father, Son, and Spirit, are entirely equal. But then Edwards says there's something called the mutual free agreement, which is a kind of way to speak. Obviously, we're using analogous language here. We're talking about how humans get together in conference or something. The Father, Son, and Spirit have a mutual free agreement where they will how they are going to act economically. And it's in this mutual free agreement that they decide to act economically in a way that is fitting based on their processions. So just as there's an order of the processions, so there's going to be an order in their acting. Right? The Father is going to be the one who sends. The Son is going to be the one who is sent of the Father. The Spirit is going to be the one who is sent of the Father and the Son. And so there's a certain order established. But notice that Edwards is going to say they actually mutually agree. This isn't a covenant, and that's going to be important, we'll see. But they are mutually agree that this is how we're going to act. All of this is then prior to the eternal covenant of redemption, which again is a willed covenant between the Father and the Son, based on their mutual free agreement. Father, Son, and Spirit are affirming this is how we're going to act economically. And then the Father and Son enter into a covenant because the covenant's going to require the humiliation of the Son. It's in the eternal covenant of redemption based on their willing to act a certain way that the Son covenants with the Father to humiliate himself and to take on a subordination to the Father. That's not the humiliation part. And then as we see in Philippians 2, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, dying a slave's death. That is his humiliation, taking on flesh and dying this way at the hands of his own creatures. And because there's humiliation and subordination, the Father and Son enter into a covenant. The Spirit's not actually a part of this covenant, not that he doesn't have investment in it, but because his role isn't a role of humiliation. And so at the top level, there's no inferiority in either glory or nature or attributes or any of that. Then you have the mutual free agreement where they will a certain way, and then they take on this subordination. And Edwards says after this mutual free agreement, the persons are going to embrace this society of behavior, right? They're going to act this way. The Father and Son are going to accept this role, and at the end of time, the Son is going to lay this kingdom down at the feet of the Father, once again embracing the life he has with the Father in the utter fullness of his deity. Prior to that time, from the eternal covenant of redemption till the time that he lays it down at his feet, Edwards will say, it is as though the Son was incomplete without her. Because he takes on humiliation, and he takes on subordination out of love for his own. And he will bring her into union with himself to offer himself with her together as one to the Father. And so as we move from eternity into time, we're at this point where we have to pay very close attention to this is eternal, but it is not ontological. It's not constitutive of God's life. There is no ontological subordination of the Son, even though there is, in Edwards' thought, an eternal subordination of the Son. So I hope that helps clarify some of those issues.
Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Edwards. For more information about the Jonathan Edwards Project, check out kylestrobel.substack.com, where you can subscribe for free. All paid subscribers also have access to long-form content on Edwards, Reformed theology and spirituality, and the evangelical spiritual theology tradition that has a word-centered, spirit-empowered, full-life spirituality. Thank you again.